Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's wait a few seconds for enough time for everyone to connect. Okay, I think we can start. So good afternoon and welcome to this workshop on your rights in the European Union. It is organized by the European Disability Forum and the Slovenian National Disability Council. My name is Marine Ulri and I'm the Human Rights Officer at EDF. Before we start today, I will share with you some information and housekeeping rules on how the workshop will work. So Jan, can you please go to the next slide? This workshop has language interpretation in English, Slovenian, International Sign, and Slovenian Sign Language. There is also real-time captioning in English with an additional link in the chat box. And you also have automatic in Slovenian, Estonian, Portuguese, Spanish, and Czech. You should find the link for the captioning in the chat box. When you open the link, you should click on the icon on the left and you will see a flag. By clicking on the flag, you will be able to choose the language for the automatic captioning. If you have any question, technical question, you can please contact my colleague Raquel, the host, through the chat box. And for content questions, you can use the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. We will also have time during the Q&A for oral intervention, so you should be able to ask for the floor if you want to make comments orally as well. The workshop is recorded and will be shared with the participant afterwards, and we can also share the presentation, the PowerPoint, with you afterwards. For EDF members, you should be able to find it on the member area on our website. I'm very pleased to have with us Pat Clark, who is EDF Vice President, and Goran Kustura, who is the Secretary General of the Slovenian National Disability Council, for introductory remarks. So I will now give the floor to Pat Clark.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Dear members of EDF, dear participants, I wish you all a very good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this online workshop on your rights in the European Union, organized together with our colleagues, the Slovenian National Disability Council. The object of this workshop is to present the updated version of the EDF booklet, Your Rights in the EU. During these 2 hours, we will give you a presentation of the booklet and share information on the basic EU citizens' rights, with a focus on employment and seeking compensation. Other topics that will be addressed are structural funds, accessibility, passenger rights, and the freedom of movement, as well as youth programs. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions and to take part in a quiz to test your understanding of what will be presented today. Knowing your rights is very important. And thanks to the development of EU laws and policies, our rights as persons living in the European Union have improved, from better accessibility to equality in employment and freedom of movement. Even if we all know that a lot still needs to be done to guarantee the rights of all persons with disabilities, we should also claim the rights that we already have. To do so, we need to know what the law says and which opportunities the European Union gives us. We also need to know how to get support and ask for compensation. This workshop will not go into details on the content of laws and all the rights granted by the European Union. Instead, we will give you an overview with some tips on where you can find more information. At EDF, we are here to support you, so we can count on you to participate actively and ask all the questions that you have. And I wish you a very fruitful and productive afternoon and the rest of the meeting. Thank you and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat, for those remarks. Now I will give the floor to Goran Kustua.
Thank you, Maureen. Good afternoon, EDF members, participants, friends, and colleagues. So we appreciate very much that EDF has prepared the updated guide to persons with disabilities rights in the EU, as it addresses some of the key issues for the disability movement. And we're having it translated into Slovenian, by the way, and it should be finished in about a week. As we all know, although social policies are a national competence, for a while now, they have been increasingly influenced by European policies and strategies and European funding as well. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say, and at least in the case of Slovenia, the major improvements in 10 years stemmed largely from Crpd ratification and entry into the EU. The publication provides an excellent overview of the historical context and timeline of disability policies and a bird's eye view of EU institutions along with their mechanisms. The guide also provides a wealth of information with regard to seeking redress. This is extremely important in many ways, including because the CRPD leaves some unanswered questions that can only be had with jurisprudence. Countries took very different approaches to CRPD ratification, and some countries with stellar human rights records like Ireland or the Netherlands have only recently ratified the convention because they wanted to make sure they would meet all the obligations, while Eastern European countries, including Slovenia, were very quick to ratify it, even when some of those obligations might not have been met. Slovenia, for instance, now has a Personal Assistance Act, an outstanding one, but hypothetically speaking, were it not to have one, would persons with disabilities be able to take the Republic of Slovenia to court for failing to comply with Article 19, independent living? Which court? Would they succeed? What would be the ramifications of that? It's not always easy to say, because there's not a lot of jurisprudence, and what there is, especially in the European Court of Human Rights, is somewhat ambiguous. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that the United States have never ratified CRPD, and it was tried in the Senate twice. Not because they disagree with the commitments, after all, CRPD was largely based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but because the best legal minds could not agree whether CRPD is a policy in statement or a policy in substance. And ultimately, the reasoning prevailed that while internationally binding, it is an aspirational document, while actual policies should be a matter of national law. It's a different philosophy from our own. We see CRPD as a policy in substance, but for particular rights, it does take jurisprudence to set clear legal standards. And in this sense, the EDF guide provides a map for redress seeking in specific situation. And we believe this is very important and helpful, and that complaints procedures is a tool in our toolbox that should be used much more often. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Goran. So now we can move to the first part of the workshop, which is the introduction to the booklet and how to use it. So as Pat and Goran mentioned, the objective of this workshop is to present the updated version of the booklet, Your Rights in the EU. So I would like to start with a short introduction, but before that, it would be interesting for us to know how many of you have heard about the booklet before today's event. So we'll have a poll that will be launched on your screen. Raquel, can you launch the poll with the question? So it's just for us to know whether you have heard about the booklet before today's event, to have a sense of whether you received the information in the past year, whether you already have some information about the booklet and your rights in the EU. So we'll leave maybe 5 more seconds. For now, it's a bit half-half. Okay, I think everyone answered. So yes, 45% said that yes, they've heard about the booklet, and 54% no. So it's really great to see that some of you will learn more about the revision that were made, and some of you will discover what the booklet is about and how to use it. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So the first version of this booklet was published in 2018, so 3 years ago. And we decided to have these booklets because we realized that a lot of people living in the EU, including sometimes organizations of persons with disabilities, did not necessarily know all the rights that the EU grant them, and also how to use those rights. Not everyone has a good understanding also about how the EU works. And we found that this lack of information was really detrimental for a person with disability in Europe. We also realized that the legislation, whether it's at EU level or national level, is changing a lot. So we also realized that we would need to revise this booklet almost yearly, if not yearly, every 2 years. So that's what we decided to do. And what we will present to you today is actually the third revision of the booklet, which was finalized last month, and that is being advertised today. Our booklets are so far available in easy to read English, in French, in Spanish, Portuguese, Slovakian, and Greek, and as Karen mentioned, very soon in Slovenian. So not all language versions have been yet updated to this year version, but they will be probably by January, thanks to the work of our members. And we would, of course, very welcome more translation in more languages to make sure that more persons with disability can have access to them. We also encourage you to share the easy to read version in English, which is also really practical, and we'll post maybe the link to it in the chat. Next slide. You can find the revised booklet on our website. So if you go on EDF website and you go to either menu, take action, and your rights in the EU, you can find there all the information on your rights in the EU, as well as the booklet. You can also find it under the library, Know Your Rights. And I'm showing on the screen the web page from our website where you can find the information and download it. But we will also post the link in the chat later on. Next slide. The booklet is composed of 6 parts that gives you different type of information. So the first part is about what is the European Union. It gives you some basic information about the EU institution, so the European Commission, the Council, the Parliament, and other relevant bodies such as the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Region. It explains also how the EU makes law and what type of law can be adopted by the EU. So we also explain, for instance, the difference between regulation and directive. We will not get into the details today, but you can find the information in the booklet. The part 2 is about before and after 1997. So there you can read why this year was a turning point for persons with disabilities. It was actually the year that marks the creation of the European Disability Forum, but also the first time that the EU agreed that disability should be referred to in the EU treaties. Then part 3 gives you information about the EU framework on the rights of persons with disabilities. So there we talk about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We also talk about the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Disability Strategy, the EU funds, and we also give you some key dates and timeline of landmarks so you can understand how the EU contributed to increasing the rights and the laws related to persons with disabilities. Then the part 4 is really important because that's where we explain what are your rights in the EU. Some of those will be presented today in the next section, but the booklet covers other areas that we will not talk about today. So for instance, your rights as consumers when you order something online, your rights as victims of crime or as suspect or accused of crime, what happens when you want to seek healthcare abroad, also your electoral rights. Then in the part 5, you can find information about defending your rights and seeking redress. That's something that will also be covered in the workshop. So which bodies you can contact to get more information about your rights, but also where can you send a complaint if your rights have been violated. And then the last part of the booklet is about looking at the future, recommendation on what should be done at EU level and some recommendation for changes. Next slide. So this booklet is a really good tool, first of all, to better understand the role of the EU, get more knowledge about your rights under EU law, and also to understand who you can contact and complain to. It's also good for you as a person with disabilities, so for your own knowledge and empowerment, but also as an organization of persons with disabilities to better inform your members and other individuals in the country. So you can also use it as a basis for instance, for your own workshop or your own work. And you can always also contact EDF for more information on that. Next slide. It's also important to keep in mind that some of the rights really depends on your national law. So the toolkit really gives you some basic information about what your country should be doing in light of the EU law. And more information can also be found with like link through the toolkit, but it doesn't necessarily say what your country, what the law in your country is. So you should always also check what your country provides and then see whether it's compliant with EU law, but we'll talk about that a bit also later on. This booklet also does not replace legal advices that you can receive from qualified lawyers in your country and different authorities in your country. So it's just general information, but it doesn't give legal advices. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, it needs to be regularly updated in light of the development at EU level. So as I mentioned, some booklets in other languages date of 2018. So thanks to our member, they would be revised, but always check the date of the booklets because things might have changed. But what we will present to you today and what you can download on our website in English is the really updated version in light of EU law. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So now I'm really happy to give the floor actually to my colleague from EDF Secretariat who will present to you different rights under their area of work. So we'll start with Aidan Amersley, who's EDF Social Policy Officer, and who will give you information first about the right to employment, and then on structural fund. Aidan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marine. So hello, everyone, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. As Marine mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about two things. So I heard that there was quite a lot of interest in the rights that the EU affords around employment. And then I'll talk about the structural funds, which a lot of our social policy work goes into. So maybe we can move to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so essentially the basis for protection against discrimination in employment is from an EU directive from the year 2000, which is called the Directive Establishing a General Framework for Equal Treatment in Employment and Occupation. The first thing that I should mention is that it's an EU directive. So what this means is that it's not a law that's applied directly in the member states, but rather it's a guidelines of minimum standards that the EU member states should apply and that they should present in their own national laws. My understanding is that most of our participants today are joining from Slovenia, although I think we have participants from a little bit all over the EU. Essentially, the things I will describe in the directive normally should be present in Slovenian or any other national legislation. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, so we call this process of adapting the provisions within a directive international law transposition. And if you follow any EDF webinars, you'll probably hear this word quite a lot, transposition. And essentially it means that upon the adoption of this directive starting in the year 2000, there was a time limit in which the member states had to reflect these provisions in their own national law. If there wasn't any existing legislation on non-discrimination in employment, new laws had to be created at the national level. If the existing national laws didn't meet up to what's said in the directive, they needed to be changed. If a member state, however, had a law that goes beyond what the directive said and is more protective in terms of non-discrimination, this is fine and can be left. So the directive, as I mentioned, kind of gives the minimum standards that should be achieved in non-discrimination, but the member states are free to go beyond this. So next slide, please. Okay, so after all of that introduction, we should talk about what the directive actually says. So firstly, it says that persons with disabilities are protected or need to be protected in national law against discrimination when they work or have work-related training, especially regarding pay and working conditions. And that they should also be assured the right to membership in organizations of workers or employers. So particularly participation in trade unions. The directive isn't just about disability. So it also protects persons on the ground of their sex, race, age, sexual orientation, and religion. So next slide, please. And as I said, all being well, the provisions that are in this should appear in your national legislation. So there should be provisions to stop discrimination, especially on pay and working conditions on the basis of disability now in the national legislation in all of the 27 EU member states. This is a very difficult it's a difficult directive to judge the implementation of because it's in practice, as many of you will know, unfortunately very difficult to prove discrimination in the areas mentioned before, and also in recruitment and the furthering of job opportunities on the basis of disability. And we hear from people that contact us that there are cases of suspected discrimination, but it's often very hard to follow up on this and to prove this. So this is one of the big difficulties that comes with the implementation of this directive. Next slide. Another important thing it mentions in the directive is that the employer is obliged to provide reasonable accommodation. So we always use this term reasonable accommodation, which most of you will know, but people outside of the disability movement often don't know. It's the adaptations to a workspace or working arrangements for a person with disabilities. So according to the directive, changes must be made on the basis of a worker's needs if they are reasonable. And this can be things such as removing physical barriers by installing ramps, facilitating access of visually impaired employees to information technologies, or altering working times to accommodate the needs of workers with disabilities. And failure to provide reasonable accommodation constitutes discrimination. Now, something I should point out is that although in this presentation and in our guide, our booklet on your rights in the EU, we've clarified what reasonable accommodation is, and we've put it in this second bullet point on this slide. One of the weaknesses of the directive is that it doesn't describe what reasonable accommodation is. And for this reason, it's one of the most common forms of existing discrimination at the national level. So next slide. Yeah, the first point is saying in this slide is just saying what I've already said. It's one of the most common issues workers with disabilities face. And it's partly because the directive itself doesn't describe what actually needs to be done to ensure reasonable accommodation. And that this is, since this isn't specified at the EU level, it gives space to differences in the national legislation. So in your country, there might indeed be guidelines on what reasonable accommodation means, but the EU doesn't oblige at this stage any clarification of what reasonable accommodation is, which again makes it very hard to prove when it hasn't been provided. So next slide, please. We're hoping this is something that's going to improve. So as part of the new EU disability strategy, the Commission will release a package for improving labour market outcomes for persons with disabilities. And one of the things this could include is guidance on offering reasonable accommodation. So hopefully a sort of guide to clarify this vagueness that currently exists in the non-discrimination directive on employment. And we hope that this will improve quite significantly the situation in some member states where reasonable accommodation is poorly offered to workers with disabilities. I should also mention, as part of the disability strategy, the Commission will create a report on the implementation of this directive so far. So that's going to be very interesting for us at EDF, and we'll get a better idea of actually areas where the directive isn't being implemented, and perhaps even member states where it's being especially poorly implemented. Next slide. Okay, and then so moving on from that particular directive, we can talk about other EU employment rights. This one is a very well-known right, but it's still something that's quite difficult for persons with disabilities. So as an EU national, which means somebody that has a passport of an EU member state, you have the right to work in another EU country without a work permit. This is something very basic in your rights as an EU citizen. It means that when you live and work abroad, you have the same rights as nationals of the host country regarding access to work, assistance from employment services, and financial support to help you find work. But we see many difficulties for workers with disabilities being able to enjoy this right in practice, because when you rely on other support services as a person with a disability and you move to another member state, your disability assessment often isn't recognized, and the delay it takes in order to be firstly recognized as having a disability and then to be entitled to the support in that country can take a very long time and can leave people without any support for quite a long period, which becomes a huge risk. So all in all, it becomes an EU right that very few persons with disabilities can actually enjoy. And we do quite a lot of work on this in EDF, but I won't talk about it much more for now, because I think we would need another webinar for that. Okay, very good. So I think that's all for employment, and we can go to the next slide. Indeed, so we will talk about structural funds. Because this is one of the areas where in social policy where the EU can actually do quite a lot simply by investing EU money. So we can go to the next slide. As you might know, the EU provides funding for a broad range of projects and programs covering areas such as regional and urban development, employment and social inclusion, agriculture and rural development, maritime and fisheries policies, research and innovation, and humanitarian aid, and so on. You'll probably in your respective home countries have seen signs of infrastructure or various projects that have been co-funded with EU money, and you'll see, you know, how present it is actually in the daily life of many Europeans. So the European Structural and Investment Funds, which we call ESIF, and which under the new multi-annual financial framework comes under the title Cohesion, Resilience and Values, are the second part of the EU budget. So we can go to the next slide. These funds aim, among other things, to improve accessibility, to fight poverty and social exclusion, to facilitate the transition from institutional to community-based care and services. This was something that was mentioned previously, so it's very much about making alternatives to institutional care for persons with disabilities. And it also seeks to increase education and employment opportunities for persons with disabilities in the EU. So we can go to the next slide. So in terms of your rights, or legally what the regulations governing the use of the funds says, there's a regulation which is called the Common Provisions Regulation. And for the funds, most of the funds that I just mentioned, it's essentially a document that gives the general rules that need to be followed in order for the funds to be able to be used. Yes, so we can go to the next slide. So it states a number of things. I'm going to start with something which actually isn't in the slide, and it was a slide I was meant to add and unfortunately neglected to. So, but it's a very important thing, so I'll mention it straight away, which is that in the selection of operations, so the selection of what things can be funded using EU money, the national authorities need to establish and apply criteria and procedures which are non-discriminatory, and also to ensure accessibility to persons with disabilities. Now, I wanted to mention this because it was something that wasn't in the original proposal for the regulation, but that EDF fought very hard to include. And essentially, it clarifies very well, it expresses very clearly that the EU-funded actions need to take into account accessibility for persons with disabilities, which means that if you observe something, infrastructure or processes which are clearly inaccessible to persons with disabilities, that very clearly goes against the regulation and is a poor use of EU funds and something that can easily be contested. So coming back to my slides, the regulation also states that when it comes to selecting and monitoring how the funds are used, non-governmental organizations and bodies responsible for promoting social inclusion, fundamental rights, the rights of persons with disabilities, gender equality, and non-discrimination must be included in the process. So what does this mean? It's something that sounds quite general, but it essentially means that there's a body that works with the national managing authorities on selecting which things are eligible for EU funding and actually where the funding will go and which proposals for funding are successful. And in that body of representatives, organizations of persons with disabilities should be involved. And most typically this would be a national council, or if it's funding specifically within a region of the country, perhaps a representative organization of that region. The Common Provisions Regulation also contains what are known as horizontal enabling conditions. And these again are kind of bullet points of rules that need to be observed globally for all of the funds that come under the Common Provisions Regulation in order for funding to be approved. One of the things that the horizontal enabling conditions state is that member states must have a national framework for implementing the UN CRPD in order to get funding. So for all of you that are joining from EU member states, normally either your country should have its own national framework for implementing the UN CRPD, or in countries where that hadn't existed until recently, normally it's in the process of being done now in order for the country to receive funds, or has perhaps just been done. And I imagine that if that's the case, many of your organizations would have been involved in that. So we can go to the next slide. So we have what are called the horizontal enabling conditions, and then we also have the thematic enabling conditions, which play a similar role, but they're a little bit more specific, and they apply to specific funding strands. So for example, they state that funding from a fund that's called the EU Regional Development Fund. In this case, it states that funding must show measures to promote community-based services, including prevention and primary care, home care, and community-based services, and thus cannot be invested in institutions for persons with disabilities. So this is, with the EU funds, one of the things that we work on the most, and I think it's also one of the most commonly common cases of non-respect of the laws regarding EU funds is investment in institutions for persons with disabilities. But in fact, according to the EU regulations, at least EU money cannot go into institutional care for persons with disabilities. So that's, such cases can always be contested, but it's always dependent on spotting the investment quite early on before, of course, the construction or renovation of an institutional care setting has taken place. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the sign that actually my part of the presentation is over, and I will hand back to Marine. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aidan. So everyone, please do not hesitate to already send your question through the Q&A box for the part on Q&A. But now we'll move directly to the part on accessibility. And for this one, I will give the floor to my colleague, Meher. You have 10 minutes, please, Meher.
Thank you, Marine. I hope everybody can hear me and see me well. So I will try to keep in my time, and I'm going to start my timer. So today I will talk about some of the EU accessibility policies and what rights they give you as EU citizens and persons with disabilities in the EU. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I will talk about 5 main EU laws on accessibility. One will be about the European Accessibility Act, which covers mainstream accessibility, mainstream products and services and their accessibility. Another EU law is the Web Accessibility Directive, which applies to public sector authorities regarding their websites and mobile applications. Then we have an EU law on electronic communications, and this includes also accessibility for persons with disabilities. Another EU law is the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which regulates audiovisual media content. It includes also emergency television broadcasts. And also we have the Marrakesh Treaty and the EU directive on that, which addresses books and ebooks and their accessibility for persons with disabilities. Okay, so we can go already to the first, to the next slide. And this is about the European Accessibility Act, which covers mainstream products and services in the EU. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of this directive. Aidan already very well described what a directive means and what is the process for adopting national law to meet the EU directives. And all of the policies that I'm mentioning today, they are all directives. So this principle of transposition and setting minimum EU requirements all apply to them. So just to give you a brief overview, the Accessibility Act was adopted in April 2019. It still needs to be transposed by all EU member states. They have a deadline for this by end of June next year, 2022. And also the act will start to apply starting from June 2025. But there are some exemptions on some aspects. There can be delays. I will not detail these because I will in the end mention some resources where you can get more information. And also if you have questions at the end, of course, I can answer. And also in parallel to the transposition process, EU has launched a standardization process for the act. So there will be several standards developed to ensure the Accessibility Act is implemented correctly, and standards are basically technical guiding documents that will help services and providers to ensure that their services and providers and products meet the legal requirements of the Act. So to go forward, just to briefly again mention that the Accessibility Act has a very strong digital focus. It includes products such as smartphones, tablets, computers, ticketing machines, check-in machines, all kinds of payment terminals, also smart televisions, banking services, for example, ATMs, e-books and e-readers. For services, it includes online shopping, for example, telephony services, including calling the European emergency number 112, certain elements of air, bus, rail, and waterborne passenger transport services. And there are exemptions to many of these, what I'm mentioning. But again, these are too detailed to go into right now. You can get the information later. One thing I want to highlight is that there is also an annex about accessibility of the built environment in the Act, but this annex is not mandatory for member states to transpose. So if your country decides to transpose these requirements, then they will be mandatory in your country, but your country does not have the obligation to transpose this part of the Act. There are also articles referring to public procurement of products and services. So whichever products and services are covered by this Act, public bodies need to make sure that they meet the accessibility requirements when they purchase these products, for example. And also it makes reference to other EU laws, such as the EU funding instruments that Hayden mentioned. Another strong, important point in this Act is that it gives you the right as a consumer to go to court if you see issues with the application of the directive. It also gives organizations of persons with disabilities the right to go to court on behalf of persons with disabilities. It also implies penalties for services and products that don't meet the accessibility requirements. And also it gives the national authorities the right to remove products and services from the market, and then they have to be pulled out from also in other countries if this product is pulled out from the country's market if it's not accessible. Going forward, you can see links to different resources that we have on the Accessibility Act. When the presentation is shared, I invite you to click on them and familiarize with these resources in more detail. So we move to the second directive. Sorry, this is about the web accessibility of websites and mobile applications of, for example, your city council or your Ministry of Justice. And it says that they have to be accessible for persons with disabilities, but it also requires them that they have an accessibility statement about the accessibility of the website or mobile application, that it gives the possibility for feedback and to request alternative formats when the website is, for example, not accessible. It also obliges member states to designate public authorities to enforce the Web Accessibility Directive and also get complaints from people, monitor and report about the implementation. To go to the next slide, again, these are resources about the Web Accessibility Directive, so I will not state them in detail. Moving forward, we go to the Electronic Communications Code. And this is a directive that is very, very big and very broad. It includes a lot of different aspects of electronic communications. But for us, the important aspect is rights of what is called in the directive end users. And these are basically the individual consumers of mobile services, for example, or internet services. And it has provisions that ensures that persons with disabilities enjoy equivalent access and choice to good quality, affordable, publicly available electronic communication services, such as internet services and mobile services. For example, you have Skype calls, WhatsApp, email, etc., this kind of services. But also it includes emergency services, by contacting the European Single Emergency Number 112. And also regarding public warnings. For example, if you have a big flood in your country and then the emergency service sends an SMS to everybody or some other way communicates through the mobile network, they have to be also accessible for persons with disabilities. To move to the next slide. This directive also says that countries must ensure that persons with disabilities have access to affordable and available terminal equipment. So for example, accessible smartphone or accessible computer. They should be given other specific equipment when it's necessary for them. For example, assistive technologies. And also member states have to ensure that services enhance equivalent access through new technologies such as total conversation. Total conversation is basically the technology that allows you to type in real time, to have a voice communication in real time and also video communication, all of these in real time to do simultaneously. So this is called total conversation. And also relay services, which are intermediary services, for example, for deaf people to contact a sign interpreter that then contacts an emergency service or other service on their behalf to translate their communication. Moving to the next slide. Again, you see many resources on the communications code. I see that Maureen is sharing all these resources also in the chat. Great. We can move to the fourth directive for accessibility. This is about audiovisual media. And I want to stress that it is about regulating the audiovisual media content. So it regulates, for example, how film is accessible for persons who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or partially sighted, and it doesn't regulate the website accessibility. I will take just maybe 2 more minutes if it's okay, Maureen. So what does it mean that the content is accessible? It means that services should provide subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, sign language interpretation, audio description, audio subtitles. So through these means, they must make the content accessible for persons with disabilities. It also requires that when there are public emergency broadcasts by television, that they are accessible for persons with disabilities. To go to the next slide. Thank you. It also designates member states that they have a single, easily accessible and publicly available online contact point for providing information and receiving complaints about accessibility from persons with disabilities. And also one of the other aspects is that it prohibits discriminatory and hateful speech towards persons with disabilities. And as many EU directives, the shortcoming of this one is that it's quite vague. It doesn't set concrete timelines, concrete amount of content that needs to be accessible. So these are things that are regulated on national level. So it really depends on how deep and how detailed your national law goes into these different aspects. And finally, yes, we have the resources, of course. And finally, we get to the Marrakesh Directive and Treaty. This is an international treaty that aims to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. And what it does, it basically, this treaty weaves certain copyright restrictions from books and ebooks to allow that accessible formats are disseminated widely so persons with disabilities have access to them. For example, an authorized body such as a library can create, or an organization of persons with disabilities can take a book, create an accessible copy for this publication, and then disseminate among other bodies in different member states. So persons with disabilities throughout the EU have access to books and ebooks. The next slide, please. So basically, this is information about the ratification of the treaty in 2018 by the EU. And so EU adopted a directive based on this. And also there's a council decision which sets the conditions for non-EU country requirements when the publications come from outside of the EU, for example. And the work on this was led largely by the European Blind Union. So there's the website, the link to their website. You can get more information there. And with this, I will conclude my part of the presentation and welcome questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meher, also for trying to stick with time. I think it really shows that there are a lot of laws that have been adopted on accessibility. Also now it's a matter of transposition and implementation, but we can have maybe more discussion about that later on. And I'll move to passenger rights and freedom of movement that will be presented by my colleague, Marie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marine, and also the previous speakers. If you could move to the next slide, please. So we all like to travel, right? So of course, now there's a pandemic, but before we traveled a lot by plane, by rail, by coach, and by boat. And on all these modes of transport, there is actually EU legislation, which should guarantee your rights as a passenger, but also specifically as a passenger with disabilities. Just to give you maybe a quick FYI in the beginning, is that in this case, coach means long distance coach. So this would be, for example, Flixbus, Eurolines, etc. This does not mean urban buses. So this is from a distance of 250 kilometers travel upwards. And also boat excludes cruise ships. So this is general boat services like regular passenger services and not cruises. So next slide, please. And I think in this whole training or workshop is really interesting in a way because it explains to you really, if you maybe remember, there was a sketch, an online sketch a few years ago about the topic, what has the EU ever done for you? I think this is a very good one because here you really see practically in your everyday life how EU law actually helps you and actually gives you rights and even right to actually cash compensation. So this is, I think, really important. It was one of the first regulations that was adopted where you as a passenger can actually get your money back, or you can even get a compensation. So even, let's say, not just your money back for the ticket, but you can even get more money for the damages or the losses that you have had when you were traveling. And this, in this case, refers to your right when buying a ticket and making a reservation. Also, your right to transport, that you as a person with disability or without disability, you have right to be transported. The transport provider cannot just refuse transport for random reasons. Your right to assistance. This is specifically interesting, I think, for persons with disabilities. Your right to compensation also for damaged, lost, or destroyed mobility equipment. So think of the classic broken wheelchair after a flight. The horror, I think, of everyone when you see your wheelchair and it's been dropped from several meters from the load of the plane on the tarmac. We've heard stories about this. And of course, also your right to complain. And Marine will go more into this detail about how to complain and how to claim your right in the last section of this training. But unfortunately, this sounds really good, but there are still a lot of exemptions. So as I mentioned in the beginning, not all bus and coach trips are included, not all boat trips are included, and even on the right, for example, to transport, there are exemptions, for example, if you travel by plane, and this is specifically mentioned, if the airplane hold, so the door of the storage part of the plane is not big enough, for example, to accommodate your wheelchair or mobility equipment, then they are not obliged to transport you. And also they are not obliged if they specifically request you to travel with an assistant. So this is something for us which is really a big problem. And if they deny boarding, as it is the language of the regulation, so if they do not allow you to board the plane, they do have to give you an explanation. But of course, you have the issue that you are standing at the gate, and in that moment, what are you going to do? Maybe you're stuck somewhere abroad. Maybe you have to go to an important work appointment. Maybe you want to go on holidays. You have already booked a hotel and you might miss some nights in the hotel. And of course, in that moment is the question, do you still travel, or do you wait and hope the problem will be solved, or do you go back home? So there are some problems with the regulations, and in general, I think we have gained already a lot, but there can still be improvements. Further, please. I'll actually go back to the last slide, because I think then I can say some more things about this. So for this, we have asked several times to the European Commission and the EU institutions to improve their legislation on passenger rights, so to fill these gaps. And in rail transport, we had some successes. So last year, the regulation on rail passenger rights was revised. And for example, we managed to shorten the time that you need to pre-notify for assistance at stations. We wanted, of course, to completely abolish it and make it 0. But in the end, we ended up to reducing it by half. So from 48 hours to 24 hours. But yeah, we definitely also see improvements there. The same is true that you still have to give a longer notification time when traveling by bus. And the same is true for air. Whereas if you normally arrive at the station or at the airport, they would still have to try and provide you assistance. And most of the time this is also possible, but it's just not that you have this reassurance beforehand if you pre-book that you know for sure there will be someone waiting for you. So we are at the moment working and trying to improve this framework. There is a strategy that was published last year in which the European Commission has promised to improve the implementation of those rights, so to be stricter on the enforcement. That will be interesting to see how this will be done in practice. So will transport operators be punished if they, for example, do not apply the laws, or will there be new legislation to fill those gaps? That is not, we don't know yet, but of course we hope for both. And also there will be more in the strategy, in the strategy, they also announced to simplify this whole framework of passenger rights. Because at the moment, as you see, we have 5 different regulations, which makes it really complicated, and they have similar provisions, but they are not all exactly the same. So maybe you have read this also in the booklet, that they slightly differ from one transport mode to another, which is just a result of them being developed one after another. So that's why actually we asked also beforehand to harmonize and strengthen all of these regulations and ideally come up with one common framework. And also to fill the last gap, the big one, which we see really in this group of laws, is that there is nothing on urban transport. As I mentioned, this only concerns long distance transport, and we would ideally also have metros, trams, urban buses, light rail, urban rail, all of this covered by these regulations. Because in general, we have seen they have been a real success story. And I can tell you, I have used already this legislation more than once being at the airport. I have been denied boarding, not because of a disability, but because of overbooking. And even there, you can have a look at your rights in the EU booklet. These normally airlines are not allowed to do. So I would really recommend to you, print the booklet, or even just print the legislation, which is linked in the booklet. And if you ever have a problem, at the airport, at the station, just show them this legislation, because often it helps really if you show the staff that you know your rights. And this is really one big recommendation I can give you. It's really to be applied in practice. Reference this legislation, say, look, I know that I have the right to this. And in the case of air transport, for example, you can get compensation, as I mentioned in the beginning, between 250 and 600 euros, depending on the length of the flight. And in rail transport, this can be up to, depending on how much the delay was or how long the cancellation, can be 50% of the ticket price. If you, for example, had a delay of more than, I think it was 90 minutes, I think, on the long distance trains. So there are really a lot of practical things here to consider. And yeah, please have a look at the booklet or ask some more questions. I'd be happy to answer them later. And the next slide. So we also want to talk today about the EU parking card, which many of you will also be familiar with. Again, a very practical card that a lot of you already have. And it's something for me which also embodies really the EU rights, because you have it already, you can hold it in your hands, but it gives you rights everywhere in the EU. And it's something that is very practical. And as you know, the blue badge, as it is also sometimes called, because of the blue, the EU blue color, is based on a council recommendation, which is already quite old, but might be reviewed sometime soon. And it is issued by the local authorities. So you will probably get it from your municipality. So it depends on each country how this is managed. And they also decide on who gets the card. So this is something we hear a lot of complaints about, that it is not coherent, that who in which member state gets the card. Sometimes it depends on what kind of group of disability you belong to. Sometimes it depends on the percentage or level of disability. This is really a national issue that we can compare it, we can look at it, but on EU level, this is not harmonized, unfortunately. What is also a bit of a problem at the moment is that the member states, or even locally in each municipality, city, region, it is decided what benefits or which rules apply when you have this card. I can give you an example. In some member states, you can park in restricted parking areas for an unlimited amount of time. So this card gives you a right to this. Whereas in some other member states, I know concretely the example in Czech Republic, you are not allowed to stand in restricted parking areas. And so you can be towed. And if you don't know this and you are not used to this, it can really happen by accident that you get towed. And also a problem is that in some member states, you have really unlimited parking duration, and in other member states, limits apply. So again, you can be towed if you don't know the local rules. This can all be downloaded from the website of the European Commission. And if you go now on holidays in Austria or in Belgium, you can go and take this document, which is on the website, and it's also linked in our booklet, and it will tell you exactly what your rights are in this country. And next slide, I think, is there still one other one? No, that was it. So I'm looking forward to your questions and enjoy the rest of the workshop.
Thank you so much, Mary, for the very clear information about passenger right and freedom of movement. Now we'll move, last but not least, to the youth programs presented by my colleague Loredana. Loredana, if it's possible to stick to around 7 minutes because we're a bit beyond time, that would be great. Thank you very much. We cannot hear you, Loredana. I will ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you so much. Can you go to the next slide, please? Hello to all of you. And I'll try to speak about a couple of things that are linked to youth. Not everything is here, but the most important, for example, a very well-known program by all of you, which is the Erasmus Plus program. On a legislative level, it is a regulation. And I'm going to just simply say what you know, most of you, what is it? It is the exchange program, mobility program for learners, not only students, young people, but also staff now in the new one. And I'm going to focus what is it available for persons with disabilities. So first of all, there is provision for persons for persons with disabilities to get reimbursed costs linked to disability. So that can be anything as long as it is justified with a bill or whatever you can for that. Now, depending whether it is higher education, so universities, or it is simply a youth exchange, this is different, and you will see that in the user's guide of the program. Because for universities, it is the university who asks in advance for grants. In any case, make sure you say it on time, because you have to ask before you are going on a mobility. There are also costs for inclusion that can be requested. That's not a big amount, but it is something. And then very important also to know that since the new program this year has come into force, you can ask for pre-financing, because that's always very difficult when you are going on a mobility and you have to advance, especially when you have important costs related to your disability. Very important to say, and this is also for the next, for the following program I'm going to speak about, is that now there is implementation guideline for inclusion and diversity strategy, and that means that each member state should have an inclusion and diversity strategy. So make sure that you check for this, and that also inclusion officer should be appointed in each agency that is dealing with this program. You can go to the next slide. Another mobility program, and this time it is the European Solidarity Corps, and this is a volunteering program for persons, for young people in general, aged 18 to 30. You have many things. I'm not going to say what is available for everyone. Go and check the program itself, because yeah, young volunteers can go almost for, they can go for free for a maximum period of 1 year. What is available here also for persons with disabilities? The costs linked to disability, like in Erasmus also, and I didn't mention, I'm sorry, also the possibility to organize a preparatory visit to see on the spot where are you going to stay, if you need to take any further arrangements. Again, the inclusion costs. And here for this program, you have also the possibility to request some financing for reinforced mentorship. And for both programs, again, available. If the online linguistic support, which is a software to help you to learn the language where you are going to go, if that one is not manageable, because unfortunately it's not accessible, you can request some funding for face-to-face or another way to learn the language. Check, this is an important opportunity for young people, so you will hear, you can find more information about the different possibilities. You can go to the next slide. The youth guarantee. So the youth guarantee, it offers young people the possibility for a first job or to continue their education, for a placement for a traineeship. So young people can get, I think it's up to 4 months, some funding. And what is very important, before, a big problem was that young people with disabilities often were put in front of the choice to keep their disability allowance, and then they were not allowed to have the money from the youth guarantee, or they choose the youth guarantee fund and they can't keep their disability allowance. This is not anymore, it shouldn't be the case anymore. So it is a council a recommendation, and it has been reinforced last year, and this has been included as well. That this is accessible for young people until the age of 30 now, because before it was 25, and we have requested also to give some more time, because the reality we know and we see that for people with disabilities to get a first job, it can be longer. May I ask the last slide? I think I have. Yes. Another very important right for young people, it's the European Youth Card. This is a card that can be bought by young people. It doesn't cost that much. It's affordable, and it gives loads of advantages, from getting a very good price, low price in youth hostel, to reduced tickets for cultural activities, but also cinema or theater, museums, then also sometimes for shopping. In supermarkets, you have sometimes you can show your student card or your youth card, and you can get some reduction. This is not only for EU member states. Again, it's the larger EU. At this moment, it is available in 40 EU European countries, and the design of the card is different in each country, but you can benefit with your youth card from Belgium. If you go to Germany, you can use it without any problem. So if you have any questions, you are welcome. I haven't focused on what we don't have, unfortunately. I could just say for the mobility programs, and even for the youth guarantee, my colleagues have already referred to, we still have this issue of freedom of movement, because even though we have the programs implemented new and important features, like the provisions for persons with disabilities financing, but if the services would be accessible from one country into the other without any additional procedure, it would make it much easier, and then young people would really have their rights respected, because the funds are what they are, and when they are when they are all used, they are used, and it will not cover for every young student or a young learner, or simply young people who want to go on a mobility program, their costs. So that is still the reality, unfortunately. So there is a lot to improve. And again, my colleagues refer to the accessibility of the websites, and the applications linked to it are still not respecting the web directive requirements and the accessibility standards requirements. Don't hesitate to send me questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loredana. So now we'll have around 10 minutes for questions and for quiz because we're a bit behind time. So I will ask first Marie to reply to the question from Farbod on the stage of negotiation regarding the reduction of advance notice in the EU for train reservation. And then after that, we'll launch a quiz, but I'll give you more information on that afterwards. Marie.
Sorry, I cannot turn on my video because I think you turned it off before. Yeah, it is also, okay. Perfect. Yeah, sorry for deleting that question. I clicked on the wrong button. Obviously, I was not used to this. So to update you quickly, so the Rail Passenger Rights Regulation, the recast has been adopted. So it will now enter into force next year. And there are some improvements, of course, for persons with disabilities. As I mentioned, the pre-notification period will be reduced to 24 hours. And there are also other provisions now which are obligatory. So there has to be staff training. Also, railway undertakings will be liable for damage, lost, or destroyed mobility equipment, such as it was already in air travel. And there is a new general non-discrimination clause. So these are, let's say, small steps forward. We were hoping for more, as I mentioned before, but we can say that since it was already quite a good regulation, it has improved and there have not been any drawbacks so far. So I think we have to see how this will turn out, of course, in the implementation. But just in short, I think there were quite a few improvements.
Thank you, Marie. So I encourage all the participants to send your question in the Q&A, and also my colleagues, if you want to monitor the Q&A and also reply in written. And then in the meantime, we prepared a quiz for you to see whether you understood the information and then to see if you have other questions. So we'll launch a poll, which is anonymous. So please don't be shy in participating. We don't know who replied to each questions. And it's quite easy, we would say, questions about information that we presented to you. My colleagues will also post the translation of the question to Slovenian in the chat box, but I will also read each question for you. And then you can pick the option on your screen. So the first question is, under the EU directive for no discrimination in employment, is it considered discrimination if, option 1, an employer refuses to offer reasonable accommodation to an employee with disabilities? Option 2, a worker with disability is denied opportunity for training or promotion because of their disability? Option 3, both of these above. The question number 2 is, one of the weaknesses of the directive on employment is that it doesn't explain what form reasonable accommodation can take, meaning it is hard to prove there has been a lack of reasonable accommodation. Option 2, some member states have national law that offer more protection against discrimination. And this directive, I'm sorry, I think we don't see everything on the screen, so we'll read from my document. A worker with disabilities denied opportunities for training or promotion because of their disabilities. No, I'm sorry. Raquel, do you see the answer?
I just see the settings.
And then we need to okay.
But I think people are replying. So
okay, so it's good. Yeah. Then I will move to question number 3, which is true and false. The regulation for the use of EU funds, such as the Regional Development Fund and social funds, forbid investing EU money in institutions for persons with disabilities. So do you think it's true or false? Then question number 4, one of the negative aspects of the European Accessibility Act is that it doesn't allow member states to put more accessibility obligations on providers of products and services in the national law. So there again, you have to decide between true or false. Then is it true or false that you have the right to request assistance at stations, airports, and ports? Then question number 6 on the EU parking card. Who issued the parking card? Is it the European Commission, local authorities, or the United Nations? And then the last question, question number 7. Is it true or false that pre-financing is possible for persons with disabilities in the new Erasmus Plus program? So we'll still give you some more minutes to answer. So for the first question, I think everyone agreed that the EU Directive for Non-Discrimination in Employment both consider discrimination, the fact that an employer refused to offer reasonable accommodation to persons with disabilities, and also deny a worker for training or promotion because of their disabilities. See, that's for other questions, it's not really clear. So then I will ask my colleagues maybe to give more clarification on those in 1 minute. Okay, Raquel, can we close the poll and show the answer on the screen? Okay, then maybe I will ask Aidan maybe to give his reply to question number 2 and 3, especially number 3 on the use of EU fund. If Aidan is still here.
Hello, yes, I'm still here. I can't see the responses, I don't think. Perfect. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
So, and you wanted me to explain both 1 and 2 or just 2?
You can explain the 1, 2, and 3 because it's your topics.
Okay, so for 1, under the EU Directive for Non-Discrimination in Employment, it is considered discrimination if, and then we had 3 options. An employer is refuses to offer reasonable accommodation to an employee with disabilities. 2, a worker with disabilities is denied opportunities for training or promotion because of their disabilities, or 3, both of the above. And the answer is, as most people suggested, both of the above. So the directive on non-discrimination in employment covers both of those. I'll just plug in my headphone again. Then for the second question, one of the weaknesses of the directive is that, and here what we were looking for you to say is that it doesn't explain the forms of that reasonable accommodation can take, meaning that it is hard to prove that it has been denied. The second option is not what we were looking for because some member states have national laws that offer more protection against discrimination, but this isn't a weakness of the direction as such, because the directive is just there to give minimum standards for what's expected. So the fact that national legislation goes beyond this is not really a problem. In fact, it's good that we have national legislation that is even more protective. And then 3, true or false, the regulation for the use of EU funds, such as regional development funds and social funds, forbid investing EU money in institutions for persons with disabilities. And this one is true. So at least in theory or legally, no EU money should go towards investing in institutions for persons with disabilities, although it does happen, but these are cases of misuses of funds that we look to contest. So yeah, I'll hand back to you, Marie.
Thanks you very much, Aidan. So I think also the reply to question number 3 is very important, because most of the people, no, we had like 43% of respondents who were saying that it's false. So it's interesting to know. Then Meher, would you mind giving your reply to question number 4?
Yes, sure. Can you see me well? Because last time.
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, the question was one of the negative aspects of the European Accessibility Act is that it does not allow member states to put more accessibility obligations on providers of products and services in their national laws. Maybe the question is not super clearly phrased. The meaning of this question is if the national governments can go beyond the Accessibility Act when they transpose it. And as Aidan already said, in the case of directives, yes, they can do, because the EU law basically gives the grounding, the basis, the main minimum of obligations, but it does not forbid national laws to go beyond when they create requirements. So the toolkit on transposition of the Accessibility Act, which was shared in the presentation, but also I think in the chat, Marine put, it has a lot of advice on how you can advocate at national level to go beyond the Accessibility Act when the law is transposed in your countries. First, to bring one example, the Accessibility Act has a requirement on accessible communication to the 112 emergency number. So one thing that you can ask your national regulators to transpose into national law is that also it applies to the national emergency number, because in every country there is also separate national emergency numbers in addition to the European one, which is the 112. So the countries can always go beyond what the EU directive requires. So I see that many of you know that it's false, but I also see that there is still a lot of confusion, that we always also get a lot of concerns by our members, because their authorities often tell them, you know what, there is the EU law, we cannot do more than it tells us to do. But this is not true. Just this is something really important to know, that you can always go beyond unless the EU law says you cannot do it, which very often it does not. I hope this is clear.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the clarification, Meher. Then on the question on freedom of movement and the EU parking cards. So everyone replied that yes, you have the right to request assistance at station, airport, and ports. So I think that was clear. And then Marie, can you please give the answer for question number 6 on who issues the EU parking card? Is it the European Commission, as some people replied, or the local authorities?
No, it's the local authorities. And so the European Commission has actually nothing to do really with the parking card, which is interesting. So it's the council that issued the recommendation, but it is the local authorities that tell you who is eligible and that distribute the card. And maybe to question 5, you were all right. So yes, very proud of you. And maybe I can also add, did you know that assistance also means that the staff has to carry your luggage, for example, if you request so, or if you just need help for orientation? It doesn't mean that you have to sit in a wheelchair and they have to drive you around. It can also be just help finding the correct terminal or give you information. So assistance actually is quite broad defined term here, but yeah, well done.
Thank you, Marie. And then the last question on pre-financing for person with disabilities in the new Erasmus Plus program. Loredana, can you tell us whether it's true or false that pre-financing is possible?
It is true. It is now since the new program. So if you have still projects ongoing with the program before 2021, then indeed it may not be the case. You cannot have pre-financing, but with the new program, pre-financing is possible.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
So it's true.
Yeah, thank you, Loredana. So now we'll have a 5 minutes break, if it's okay with the interpreters, to just take 5 minutes because we're quite beyond time and we want to finish at 3 o'clock. Okay, so we'll take 5 minutes. We'll be back at 2:35 for the second part on how to seek redress. Okay, we will start again with the second section. Just checking that the interpreters are here. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Perfect. So now that we gave you some information about your rights under EU law, we will give you a very short overview of important bodies that can support you by giving you more information about your rights, but also help you with seeking redress. So for instance, when you face a violation of your rights, or whether you think that your country is not properly transposing and implementing EU law. So as I said, it is a very short overview and you will be able to find more information in our booklets. Next slide. So I would like to start with one very important body that exists in your country. It's equality bodies. So there are national institutions that exist in all EU member states, and their role is to raise awareness, promote equality, and very often to handle complaints when someone face discrimination. That can be a discrimination based on disability, but also discrimination based on their gender, on their age, on their ethnic origin, for instance, or sexual orientation. Their power really depends on the national legislation and the country, but they all have a role to play in advising you about your rights and to give you support about how to seek redress when you face discrimination. There is in the EU also a European network of equality bodies, which bring together 46 organizations from 34 countries. So those bodies exist also in other European countries. And on the website actually of this European network, Equinet, you can already find more information on the role of the different equality bodies by countries and how they can help you. So that's, for instance, useful if your country of residence is not your country of origin and you would like to know more. For instance, if you're in Belgium for a conference, let's say, and you face a discrimination, or you're doing a summer traineeship and you've been discriminated against, you will be able to find more information on Equinet website about what's the role of the equality body and how they can help you. Can we go to the next slide? So that's I'm showing on the screen a screenshot of the website of Equinet, and there is a map of of Europe, and then you can click on the country. We'll also post. I'll share the link on in the chat. Next slide. And now I'm showing a screenshot of the webpage of the equality body from Belgium that has a specific page dedicated to filling complaints. So this is submit an online report, and it's possible to do it in the 3 languages of Belgium, so French, Netherlands, German, and also English. So that's easy to do. They also have a dedicated phone number for questions and to support filling out complaints. Next slide. In Slovenia, the equality bodies, they advocate for the principle of equality. You can probably find more information directly in the Slovenian website, but I'm showing also on the screen some a summary of the litigation power that this body has. And I found that information on the website of Equinet, so it can represent person who face disability in front of courts. It can also decide to bring a proceeding, so a complaint about discrimination in its own name when it has been reported discrimination. It can also apparently formally decide on complaints, and that can be sometimes legally binding and non-legally binding. But for more information, I really advise you to consult directly the website of the advocate. And also, if you're not in Slovenia or from Slovenia, then consult the website of your own equality body, because they can really help you and your member a lot in case of discrimination. My colleague Aidan talked about discrimination in employment, and they should at least support you in discrimination, disability-based discrimination in employment. But depending on the legislation of your country, if your country also prohibited discrimination in the field, in access to healthcare, for instance, or education, they can also support you in complaints in those areas as well. Next slide. Then very important bodies that we should mention is the national enforcement or regulatory bodies, sometimes also referred to as the regulators. And there are national bodies that are created to verify that EU laws are being respected. So for instance, in relation to the law on passenger rights, there are transport operators. There are, regulators that are checking, for instance, that transport operators are treating all passengers in accordance with their rights. Those regulators, which are different according to each directive, would also, for instance, check that public sector bodies comply with the obligation to make their website and mobile application accessible. So they depends on the EU regulation or directive, and they're very, very specific. And in our booklet, you can find more information about each national enforcement bodies, or to contact them. If you know that legislation is not being implemented, then we really encourage you to start by contacting them, and also maybe telling us at EDF, so we're also aware of it. And for instance, my colleague working on accessibility can also monitor a little bit the process of transposition and implementation, and know about the issues that you are facing. That's also, I'm also mentioning that to you because on our website, we will also collect cases of issue of accessibility or discrimination. So that's quite important. Next slide, please. Then there's also a body that exists in the EU called the European Ombudsman, who's an impartial body specifically dealing with cases of EU maladministration, and that investigates complaints and conduct inquiry about maladministration in EU institutions, bodies, offices, and agencies. So they do not deal about complaint at national, regional, or local administration, even if they concern EU matters, but they really look, for instance, at the employment of persons with disabilities by EU institution, or accessibility of EU websites, or accessibility of EU buildings, for instance. And actually at 4 o'clock today, we'll have a specific workshop on the work of the European Ombudsman and how to fill complaints with them. So we welcome you to also join this workshop that will take place at 4 p.m. And I'll put the link in the website, the chat, if you want to register. Next slide. You can also send complaints and petitions to the Committee of Petition of the European Parliament. That's a way for the European Parliament to allow you to express your fundamental rights to petition, to know a bit more about what's happening in member states of the European Union. On the website of the petition committee, there is dedicated pages where you can provide information about your own petition. You can also do it in paper if you prefer. And that helps really the Parliament to sort of conduct what we call the reality check in the way in which EU laws are being implemented. Next slide. Other bodies to which special mandate holder to whom you can send complaints are under the United Nations. So it's also possible, as all EU member states, it's also possible for EU member states that ratify the optional protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to send complaints about violation of the convention. But to do that, you really need to fill out two conditions. The first one is that your country ratified the optional protocol to the UN Convention and that you already have made a successful complaint in your country. So it's quite demanding. It means that you already tried everything at national level to complaints about violation and it didn't work. And based on that, then the UN committee can make a decision on the complaint and tell your country that it violated your right as a person with disability and didn't respect its obligation under the UN Convention. Alternatively, you can also contact the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's easier because it's also even possible for person living in country that didn't ratify the UN Convention, and you don't need to have brought a case already in court. It's not, it's important to know, it's not a legally binding process. It's just for the UN Special Rapporteur to sort of apply diplomatic pressure in your country. So for instance, when the Special Rapporteur knows about the issue, he can, for instance, write a letter to the government to explain why it's a violation and explain what the government could do. It can be about a very specific case of a person or recurring violation that are really grave. And so that can also support you more as organization in your advocacy or where you face really a specific issue that is really, really important, timely for your government to address. Next slide. And then I also want to share some information about two interesting bodies that provide information and support services on your rights. So there is Your Europe Advice, which is services provided by legal experts. You can send them questions about your personal EU rights, and experts should answer to your question within 1 week. It's free of charge and it's in your national language. You can contact them via their online platform or by phone. You can find all the information in our booklet. So it's more about, well, you have a question about your rights and you want to know what to do, and then those legal experts will answer you quickly. And then the last body is Solvit, which is an online and free of charge services provided by national administration in each EU member states to find solution to problem that you may have with your national administration within 10 weeks of your request. So for instance, when you move to another EU member state, it can be about health insurance, unemployment benefits, it can be about your residence rights in other member states, also support in working abroad or getting your professional qualification recognized. So it's when you already have an issue and you want to have support and advice, whereas the first one is more about general questions. But the two can be complementary if you know that you're moving to another country, for instance, and you have specific questions, or even in your country. And then the second one when you face an issue. Next slide. Thank you. So yes, that was a very brief overview. I'm checking the Q&A and I don't see one question because we also have a really short quiz for you. So I will maybe reply to the question, how can we know who is the special rapporteur for our country, please? So I think if you're referring to the special rapporteur on the right of person with disabilities, there is only one, that is Gerard Quinn from Ireland, and can be contacted on his website. The link is in our booklet. You can, there are also sometimes like thematic or country rapporteur, but if it's really related to the right of person with disabilities, we really encourage you to contact the special rapporteur on right of person with disabilities. And then for equality bodies, then you need to check on Equinet website, the contact of your equality body in your country. And then are the EU advice and solve it for all EU citizens or for person with disability? So that's for all citizens, EU citizens or person residing in the EU. So it's not disability specific, but they're really legal professionals, so they can help you to have general information about your rights. If you have any contact with them, also don't hesitate to let us know how you found those services. Okay, so we will now launch the last quiz for today. Raquel, perfect. So this time I have like 3 questions for you that I will read, and again, the translation will be in the chat. So it's a hypothetical questions scenario. The first one is a person with disabilities contacts you because the employer refused to install an adapted desk at work. The employer said they should use the same desk as everyone, or they should leave, or basically get fired. Who should they contact first for a complaint? So to complain that their employer didn't want to install an adapted desk. Should they contact the UN Committee on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, the national equality bodies, or the constitutional courts? Then question number 2, your country does not respect the rules under EU law to provide assistance to passengers with disabilities when they take the train. You should contact the President of the European Parliament, the United Nations, or the national enforcement body for the regulations on passenger rights. And then number 3, your national court ruled against a case of access to education by a child with disability. You can make an appeal. Your country ratified the optional protocol of the CRPD. You can contact directly the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability instead. Is it true or false? Okay, I'll wait maybe 30 more seconds. Once again, it's anonymous, so don't be shy to reply. Okay, Raquel, can we close the poll and share the results? Perfect. So the first question on who to contact in case of a complaint against an employer, indeed, everyone replied the National Equality Body. So it's correct, well done. The second question on the non-respect of EU law to provide assistance to passengers with disabilities, who to contact. It's the national enforcement body for the regulation of passenger rights. So the question is really about non-respect of EU law. Of course, you could contact the maybe the special rapporteur, for instance, about general issue in access to transport by person with disabilities, but it wouldn't be necessarily in light of EU law, because the United Nations and the special rapporteur, the CRPD committee look at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, but not on the compliance of national legislation with EU law. And then the last questions, so I think it was a bit more tricky, maybe in the way it was formulated. So it says your national courts ruled against a case of access to education by a child with disability. You can make an appeal. Your country ratified the optional protocol to the CRPD. You can contact directly the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability instead. So that was instead of making an appeal. So there you see that one condition to send a complaint to the CRPD committee is fulfilled, which is that your country ratified the optional protocol. However, yes, there was a case brought to court, but you can still make an appeal. And until you make this appeal and you lose the appeal, you cannot, the CRPD committee cannot examine your complaint. So when we say that you should bring your case to court in your national country, it means until the last resort. If the last resort is, for instance, let's say the Constitutional Court, you should go to the higher courts, the Constitutional Court. But if you do not make an appeal, then you cannot contact the CRPD committee, even if your country ratify the optional protocol. So this one was false. The answer was false. Okay, I don't see any other question, but please do not hesitate to let us know afterwards if you have specific question. First, download the booklet and then contact us if anything is unclear. As I said, the booklet will be updated, revised, at least every 2 years. So we'll have other information session about your rights in the EU. And thank you very much for coming, and also the interpreters for their work, and Jan for the slide. I think we can go to the last slide now, and to the concluding remark from Goran. Also a big thanks to the Slovenian National Disability Council for organizing with us this workshop. Goran, the floor is yours.
No, not at all, Marin. Thank you, guys. So it's been an exciting training. We've learned the importance of not only knowing our rights, but also knowing how to defend them. We've learned about the overview of the European system, about the Equal Treatment Directive, about the horizontal enabling conditions with regard to structural funds. Mayor has presented us with various directives, Marie on passenger rights, and Loredana on the youth programs, and then Marine again on the equality bodies. So in conclusion, to fight for our rights, we have to know them, and we have to understand how to fight for them. Thank you very much, EDF. Thank you very much, colleagues, friends, interpreters. Thank you. Bye-bye.